have a huge disadvantage in terms of swimming, namely the position of our air intake. It's in front of the head. So when we swim on the belly, we cannot breathe. We have to move the head up and down in order to take a breath. We can hold the breath and look down, but then it's not gonna stay for long. We are not very good in holding breaths. So what's the solution? Well, we invented this simple implement. It's a snorkel. This moves the air intake to the top of our head. And with this fixed, we can look down and breathe at the same time. Very convenient for snorkeling, for free diving, scuba diving, and many other water activities. But there's no free lunch. Good Monday, amphinauts and DPV enthusiasts. This is Marek Swoboda with Amphi Americas, and today we'll be talking about physiological costs of snorkels. So, how much do we pay, so to speak, in order to use it? So, let's start with utility. Is it useful? The answer is yes, by all means. Snorkels are a great implement for training, for certain missions which require you to go on the surface for a long period of time, where you have to be immersed but you need to breathe. Yes, yes, and yes. Sometimes people don't use them because they think that it will mess up the rig because they have a regulator, they don't want to deal with the snorkel, so they remove it or they carry it someplace. This is all true. But nevertheless, snorkel is a very useful implement. But when we swim with snorkels, there is a certain physiological penalty we have to pay in order to use this tool. And I wanted to talk about it, and I found two interesting articles which cover some aspects of this cost. So articles are from sports medicine journals. I'll give you the links in the description box. And for now, let's start with the big picture. So as you can see here on the whiteboard, we have three groups of issues which lead to exhaustion or to more effort which is needed when you breathe with a snorkel. So the first part of this problem is a hydrostatic pressure. Because the snorkel moves the air intake very high, the lungs are usually lower, or always lower, than the air intake. It creates a hydrostatic pressure in the water which tries to squeeze your lungs. So you always have to, when you inhale, you have to work against this hydrostatic pressure. On the exhale, it helps you because it squeezes and the air goes out. But the intake, the inhale part, is a problem. Also, it's a pipe. When you pump a fluid through a pipe, you will see a resistance to this airflow. And it's a resistor, it's a pneumatic resistor. So breathing is harder when you compare breathing through the snorkel with regular breathing through your mouth and nose. So that's a second part of the problem. But there's a third part, which is the most interesting one. We have a so-called dead space. The dead space is defined as a space which does not exchange or does not exchange air with the external atmospheric gases. So when you inhale and exhale, there's always some part of your exhale which will remain in the snorkel, and you will rebreathe this used air again, and this cycle will repeat itself. So what it creates elevated concentration of CO2, carbon dioxide, in the snorkel. So every breath you take in will have a slightly elevated level of CO2. This increased CO2 concentration leads to a certain physiological stimulus. This stimulus will make you breathe more. Okay? When you breathe more, you tire more. You will need more oxygen. So even though your exercise level or your physical activity does not need that much oxygen, your body will feel that you need more oxygen because it senses elevated levels of CO2. Thus, this dead space causes you to tire quicker and more. So let's take a look at the details.
The first paper we are going to use to illustrate the points we made earlier is entitled "The Effect of Additional Dead Space on Respiratory Exchange Ratio and Carbon Dioxide Production Due to Training." It was published in 2013 in a Journal of Sports Science and Medicine. So the title says it all. Basically, we would like to show you some graphs from the paper which illustrate how carbon dioxide concentration, or here it's shown as a partial pressure, changes when we have a dead space. So I want you to look at the top panel of this graph, which shows two lines, the blue line and the red line. So you see the PCO2, which is partial pressure or of carbon dioxide, but this can be converted to concentration. So it's an equivalent of concentration, basically, if you assume the pressure is constant. So you see that this blue line is way above the red line. The difference is that the data was collected on people who had additional dead space attached to their airways, the blue line, and the red line is people exercising with no dead space attached, just regular normal exercise with no mask. And the bottom or the middle graph shows the blood pH. It's also an interesting factor here. You see that pH drops when your CO2 goes up, then the blood pH drops. Not very relevant to our conversation, but interesting thing to know. The second paper, entitled "Ventilatory and Metabolic Response to Rebreathing the Expired Air in the Snorkel," is very relevant to our discussion, and it was published in an International Journal of Sports Medicine in 2003. Very interesting studies. So they actually took a snorkel with a dead space of 165 mLs. So the volume, the dead space was much smaller than the dead space in the previous experiment. But the structure of the experiment was slightly different too. So they had two groups and they tested those two groups, one group with the snorkel, one group without. They tested them when they were relaxed, idle, doing nothing. And then they tested them when they performed some level of activities. And they tested several parameters. So, for example, they measured the tidal volume. They measured the amount of oxygen consumed by those two groups. And they measured the amount of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body mass. So let's take a look at the data. In this table, you can see the experiment performed on resting subjects. No effort, no movement, just relaxed subjects. And you see two columns which are labeled RS and RS plus. So the RS group has no dead space added, and the column RS plus represents the subjects with a dead space added. So I just wanted to discuss two numbers, two values. So you see that you have VO2, which is the oxygen flow consumption, which is in mLs per minute, milliliters per minute. So in a resting group, this oxygen consumption was 312 mLs per minute, roughly. And when we add a dead space, it jumps up to 512 mLs per minute, which is a huge increase in oxygen consumption, which is 64%, just by adding a snorkel. So this is almost equivalent to the amount of effort you have to add to your breathing when you add a snorkel. And if you want to normalize it to have kind of like a apples to apples comparison, the best number to see that would be mLs per minute of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body mass. So this is this red circle on the graph shows this line, and the increase in this particular case is close to 70%. So we can safely say that when you breathe through a snorkel, the effort associated with this breathing would be 70% more than if you have no snorkel. So this is the physiological penalty you have to pay in order to use a snorkel. But this is just for idle subjects. Those people do nothing. Let's take a look how the situation changes when we have exercise involved in this experiment. So the second table shows us pretty much the same arrangement. We have groups which are labeled ES minus and ES plus. This column ES minus represents people or subjects without a dead space, and ES plus represents subjects with a dead space added. So when you exercise, regular consumption of oxygen would be on the level of almost 1000 mLs per minute. And when you add a dead space, it will jump to 1344 mLs per minute, which represents an increase by 36%. If we normalize it for body mass, then the increase becomes roughly 39%. You see this again, the red circle shows the line where we're showing the amount of oxygen consumed per a kilogram of body mass, mLs per minute per kilogram. And 40% is still a lot. So we see that the differences are not that dramatic when you exercise, because when you exercise, you burn more oxygen just by doing something else. So the increase in your breathing effort is on top of an existing effort. Thus, those percentages are not as high as for idle individuals, but still high. You see that snorkel doesn't come free. It's still a substantial increase in your oxygen consumption Thus, it's a substantial increase in your effort due to breathing through a snorkel. So that would be pretty much it. And I think I explained to you all the possible issues which we have to deal with when we use snorkels. And we went a little bit deeper to explore this dead space cluster of issues and how it increases the breathing effort by the mechanisms which we described before.
I hope you liked this video. If so, give us a like. If you didn't like it, give us a thumb down. Please subscribe. If you have time, please visit our website where we explain how Amphi differs from other DPVs. Visit our Facebook page where we discuss interesting details about underwater technology, travels, and human physiology. So please join us. And of course, see you next Monday.